After the heartbreaking loss of their son and the shocking revelation of the midwife's involvement in the crime, Fred and Mabel were determined to seek justice. They went to great lengths, gathering evidence and enlisting legal help, hoping to expose the midwife and her evil practices. But to their horror, they discovered that the midwife wasn't just an evil practitioner, she was part of a far-reaching syndicate involved in human trafficking and organ harvesting. The local clinic, once thought to be a place of care, turned out to be nothing more than a facade, a cover-up for her dark dealings. As Fred and Mabel began to press for justice, the midwife and her sinister cohorts began to retaliate. Their threats escalated, and it soon became clear that their lives were in grave danger. The syndicate used their vast influence to manipulate the legal system, pushing the case aside, and in the shadows, they plotted to silence Fred and Mabel once and for all. The couple found themselves trapped, knowing they had no choice but to flee. Fred, filled with a sense of helplessness, made the difficult decision to abandon his career and take Mabel far from the dangers they faced. They moved to another state, trying to lay low and protect themselves. Life became increasingly hard as they adjusted to their new life, far from the comforts they had once known. But despite the change, the emotional toll of their loss and the constant threat of the syndicate weighed heavily on their hearts. Fred, unable to bear the crushing burden of their situation and the grief of losing their son, reached a breaking point. In his desperation for justice, he turned to darker means. Fred journeyed to a distant town in Ijebuode, Ogun State, where he met 3 ancient witches known for their power in dark rituals. Leaving Mabel in the care of a trusted acquaintance, Fred made a promise to return for her, determined to change the fate that had been thrust upon them. In the eerie stillness of the witch's lair, Fred made his inquiry about his stolen son. The witches, their eyes ancient with knowledge, grimly revealed the truth: his son had been used for money-making rituals. The grief and sorrow that overwhelmed Fred turned to a fiery rage. The loss of his firstborn son, the promise of fatherhood cruelly torn from him, was too much to bear. The witches, sensing Fred's fury and his thirst for revenge, agreed to help him exact the justice he craved. In the dead of night, in a clearing deep within the forest, they performed a ritual that would haunt the midwife and her cohorts forever. The 3 witches danced naked under the pale moonlight, chanting curses with an intensity that made the earth tremble. They summoned the forces of darkness, demanding the total destruction of the midwife and her entire family. The curse was clear: for every child the midwife had taken, for every life she had destroyed, she would suffer the same fate. She would bury her children, and her family would perish, just as Fred had been robbed of his joy of fatherhood. Fred's heart burned with vengeance as the witches sealed the curse, and he knew that the midwife would pay the ultimate price for the agony she had caused. Fred left the witch's lair, his heart still heavy with the weight of his actions, but resolute in the knowledge that justice, however dark and painful, had been served. He vowed to return to Mabel, and together, they would rebuild their lives. But the journey ahead was long, and the scars left by their torment would take time to heal. Fred's thirst for revenge had been quenched, but he knew that he and Mabel would never forget the horrors they had endured. Their love, tested by the deepest of tragedies, would now guide them through the uncertain future they had ahead. The midwife and her evil syndicate had been cursed, but Fred and Mabel's battle for peace and for the memory of their son was far from over. The curse that Fred had unleashed through the ancient witches was swift and unforgiving. What started as a quiet, unassuming moment in the midwife's life soon transformed into a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. The first sign of the curse's power came when her eldest daughter, Cynthia, who was in her final year at the university, suddenly fell gravely ill. It began with headaches and fatigue, symptoms that seemed harmless at first. But within days, her condition worsened, and doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. Cynthia died in her sleep, leaving her mother heartbroken and desperate for answers. The midwife, who had always been in control of her world, found herself questioning the cruel twist of fate that had struck her family. Grief-stricken and shaken, the midwife's second and third daughters, Ada and Ifeoma, who had just gained admission into the university, became the next victims. It started subtly at first, a sudden fever, dizziness, and weakness that neither they nor their mother could explain. Within days, they were both bedridden, and doctors couldn't find the cause. Ada passed away first, her body succumbing to an unknown illness that no one could diagnose. Ifeoma followed shortly after, her heart giving out in the middle of the night. The midwife, devastated and consumed by confusion, couldn't fathom why her daughters were being taken from her. Desperation gripped her, and she clung to the hope that it was all just a terrible series of coincidences. But the worst was yet to come. The midwife's fourth daughter, Chioma, was involved in a mysterious accident. It happened on a rainy evening, and no one could explain how it occurred. She was a young woman full of life and dreams, but the car accident that struck her down left her with no chance of survival. The entire family was shattered by the sudden and inexplicable loss of another beloved child. The midwife's world began to crumble around her, and she couldn't understand why her daughters were being taken in such horrific and tragic ways. Her grief was palpable, and the questions in her mind turned into a deep rage. By now, the midwife's life was in complete disarray. The deaths of her children weighed heavily on her, and the once strong woman began to unravel. But it wasn't until the death of her youngest daughter, Nneka, that the truth began to emerge. Nneka, a vibrant and ambitious young woman, had always been the apple of her mother's eye. But one evening, after a phone call with her mother, she fell ill with what seemed like a sudden fever. Her condition worsened rapidly, and within hours, she was gone. The midwife, now desperate and broken, finally began to sense something sinister in the events surrounding the deaths of her daughters. It dawned on her, the curse that had followed her, the misfortune that had haunted her family, was not random. The whisper of Fred's name, once distant in her mind, now felt like an omen. In a fit of fury and realization, she sought to confront the truth, believing it was Fred, the man she had wronged, who had brought the curse upon her family. She visited the places where her daughters had been buried, her heart heavy with guilt and dread. And it was there, in the quiet graveyard, that the full weight of the curse's reality hit her. As she stood over the graves of her daughters, the midwife fell to her knees, overwhelmed with a sense of impending doom. In that moment, the truth became undeniable. It wasn't just Fred's revenge that had condemned her family. It was the universe's way of paying back for the suffering she had caused, the children she had stolen, and the lives she had destroyed. She was the one responsible for her own downfall. Her mind, unable to handle the crushing weight of her guilt, began to crack. The once powerful midwife was now nothing more than a shell of a woman. She stumbled around, incoherent, muttering the name of Fred. Her cries for forgiveness echoed through the empty streets, but there was no one left to hear them. She had destroyed everything she had ever loved. In a final, desperate act of despair, the midwife ran through the streets, calling out Fred's name in madness, begging him for mercy, but it was too late. The curse had claimed her family, and the price for her evil deeds had been paid in full. Her once proud existence crumbled as she was left to wander the streets in a haze of insanity. She had been driven mad by her own actions, by the horrors she had inflicted on others, and by the curse that had torn her family apart. Fred's name was the last thing on her lips, and as she wandered the dark, desolate streets, she became a broken woman, consumed by guilt and grief. The retribution she had so callously inflicted on others had finally caught up with her, leaving her a hollow shell of the woman she had once been. Fred and Mabel, though scarred by the horrors they had endured, moved on with their lives. They had paid a steep price, but Fred's thirst for revenge had been quenched, and the midwife had paid the ultimate cost for her evil. The pain of losing their son remained, but they had found peace in the knowledge that justice had been served. The midwife's downfall was a reminder of the cruelty that could befall those who choose evil, and the haunting lesson that no man born of a woman would escape the consequences of their deeds. Dear story lovers, if you're new here and you're just seeing me for the first time, kindly hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon so that you get notified whenever I drop a new video. Don't forget to like, comment and share to friends and family. Goodbye, and I'll see you in my next video.